Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The storm crawled over the basin like an old cat, crackling half mean, half tired. Elias Finch rode with his collar up and his hat brim low, letting his moray pick her way along the mesquite. He wasn't hunting anything except a place to be. Dry, but the land kept its secrets tight until lightning stitched them open for a heartbeat at a time. The air was coppery and close. Every few breaths the sky trembled in its bones. He had come out late, as he often did when sleep turned to splinters. Nights made sense. Days had a way of talking at a man until he said things back he didn't mean. Nights just listened. He put the storm between himself and Town Vespers Gulch, sat in the notch behind him, lamplight smudged by rain. Let his mind fall into the steady clop of hooves and the breathing of a horse that had learned his moods better than most people bothered to. The wash smelled of creosote and wet dust. A jackrabbit bolted, white tail flashing like a thrown coin. Off to the north, a windmill leaned, wagging its blade at lightning like a man scolding heaven. Elias angled toward the higher ground where the cholla bunched and the sage held its low gray line against the dark. That was when he saw it, a flour sack slumped against a cholla. The coarse weave turned dark with the rain. It could have been a bundle of scrap, the throwaways of some freighter. Then the lightning went off again, and he heard it soft and small as breath between prayers. Mama, Elias froze. The word was not a word, not really. It was a pleading sound any human knows the shape of. It threaded the rain, found the inside of his ribs, and plucked. He slid down, boots sinking to the ankles in red muck. The sack had a blue stamp, Dorn and Sunfine flower, letters half ghosted where weather had chewed them. Twine cinched it tight, with a ranchman's not practical, sloppy at the tail. Somebody had punched 2 thumb-sized holes near the mouth, a mercy done quick and afraid. The wind tugged the canvas and made it shiver like an animal. Mama, his knife came out on muscle memory. He sawed at the twine with the restraint a man learns after he's cut himself hurrying. The knot gave, and he peeled the canvas back. She was there new as rain, purpled from cold, eyes screwed shut, mouth open on that little sound that wasn't a word, but knew how to go about becoming one. Her fists were 2 pebbles. A smear of vernix clung to one ear like the last bit of storm cloud trying to stay. Easy, he said, though the baby hadn't asked for ease. She'd asked for a mother. The cord had been tied rough and cut rougher. The stump dark and dry, which told him hours, not days. There was a scrap of calico beneath her ripped from a dress, white with little blue flowers, rain-soaked and grit-grimed, but enough to say somebody had thought about softness at the last possible minute. He slid a hand under the cloth and felt the furious flutter of her heart. His own heart misstepped, surprised to find there was any such music still in him. His hands were good at guns and reins and fence work. With a baby, they turned clumsy as hooves. He shrugged out of his duster, and out of the wool sweater beneath made a nest out of both and tucked her inside his shirt, high against the heat of his chest. Skin to skin, that was what the army surgeon had yelled once in a field hospital. Not about babies, but about a corporal with a stomach wound and a cold that had climbed into his bones. Warmth is life, the surgeon had said. Elias had believed. It then because he believed anything that made the screaming less. He believed it now because the tiny bundled thing against him had latched her mouth onto the hill of his breastbone and was working at it with solemn concentration, like she had already filed a complaint with the world and meant to follow it up. In writing, he tasted rain and laughed with something like panic. "All right," he said to the night. "We ain't dying here." He glanced around, the way a man does when trouble drops into his hands and he wants to know who's watching. The storm sketched the earth in white lines and then took it back. No lantern light, no horse. only the wash speaking its gravel talk, and the sage making that small sound it makes when the wind combs it. But the sack's stamp and the twine and the slice of calico were a kind of witness. He pulled the sack under a flat rock, no need to lead it flapping like a sign, and tucked the blue-stamped flap so a man could find it again, if he needed to ask it questions. He mounted up with the baby tucked against his heart, set his heel, and the mare lurched forward into the rain. He turned toward Vesper's Gulch, 12 miles of mud and slick, in the sort of dark that makes you count your ghosts. The baby went quiet, as if listening to his heartbeat. He remembered another sound, the drum thud inside a woman at a field. Hospital back east, his hands red to the wrists and a boy corporal crying for his mother as the surgeon leaned close with a saw. Hold him, the surgeon had said, and Elias had held. He had held a lot of dying in his time. He couldn't hold. Another, he kept to high ground where the slick was less mean, cut across a meadow that was more rock than grass. The mare telegraphed every worry through her shoulders rattler's scent. A low place that might be more water than dirt, a fence wire gone to ground, and he let her choose her line. He sang under his breath because the sound steadied his hands. It wasn't much of a song, just a childhood scrap about a yellow bird and a pie. He had a voice like a leather hinge. The baby didn't seem to mind. Once, when lightning turned the land to bleached bone, coyotes threw their thin laughter across. The wash. His mare flicked an ear. The bundle against his chest snorted. Offended by coyotes in Principal Dot, by the time he clattered into Vesper's Gulch, the storm had blown past and left a scrap-heap sky. Lanterns burned along the single street, blurred with steam and wet dust. The town sign still bragged, population 238, in faded paint, a count that never held steady. Wood creaked as the heat of the day fled the boards, and that smell of wet iron floated from August Reed's smithy like a memory of lightning that had been caught and hammered flat. He didn't go to the saloon or the livery. He went to May Kincaid's. Door and hammered hard enough to wake the dead or make them complain. May opened in a shawl, hair in a rope braid, eyes sharp as stove tools. Midwife, laundress, seamstress, maker of rabbit stew that could make a man weep. The town called her by her first name like it was a title. She looked at the bundle at his chest and didn't waste a second pretending this was any of his usual trouble. Inside, she said, already turning toward the stove. Elias stepped into heat and soap and the clean tang of pennyroyal. May's front room was part kitchen, part surgery, part church. She had a hematite crucifix on a nail by the clock, and a shelf of jars with labels in a neat hand comfrey. Willow bark, alum, asafoetida. It told you she did not much care whether you prayed so long as you took your medicine. A blue quilt draped over a chair, squares pieced from the dresses of women who had screamed on her table and then slept and woken with their babies blinking at the rude light. The quilt was not a decoration. It was acclaimed staked on a hard piece of ground. May had bricks warming in the oven before Elias finished unbuttoning his shirt. Set her here, she said, clearing a space on the table and laying a folded towel like an altar cloth. And you breathe. Men forget to breathe when the world gets small. He set the baby down, and his breath broke a little, like it had been cinched tight, and suddenly remembered it could expand. May's hands found the child's cool skin with a touch that was light and firm at once. She moved with a deliberate quickness, checking the mouth with a little finger, running her palm over the chest, the swell of the belly, the curve of the skull. The cord stump looked mean, but not sick. Ours, May murmured. Whoever tied that did it with their eyes shut. She wrapped the child in a flannel square and laid her between two bricks, swaddled in scrap cloth that steamed when the cool air touched them. The baby flinched at the heat and then unwound into it the way a hand opens when you tell it there's no more need to fist. She's hungry, May said. Elias heard the ache in the small sound the child was making. I ain't gotta. He gestured, felt foolish, and let foolish stand. None of you do, May said, not unkind. She took down a brown bottle, mixed a little molasses with warm water, and dipped a linen strip, twisting it until it made a kind of cord. This'll trick her a minute, till we can find proper milk or a breast willing to share. She touched the soaked linen to the baby's mouth. The tiny lips latched with an instinct that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with survival. Some people call that faith. May called it what it was, a body knowing how to live. Where'd you find her? May asked without looking up. When men came through her door with blood on their shirts, she asked the same way. Not shock first, but facts. Facts could be turned into action. Shock could be tended later. Salt Cedar Wash, Elias said. Headed east of the windmill. Flour sack Dorn stamp. Twine tied wrong. Holes punched for air. May's mouth made a line that wasn't. Quite a frown. People do cruel before they do difficult. Elias watched her hands. They didn't shake. They never did, even when other women shook and cursed her and told her to get that child out of them like it was a snake. He'd seen. Her elbows braced bloody, and her jaw set, and a prayer said almost as an afterthought. He had never seen her back up from a thing. Any of your women expecting? He asked. May's eyes flicked to the little window where the storm smudged itself on the night. One, too soon to be likely. Two others late, but they ain't late enough. We'll find out. What if somebody? Comey's to claim her who? His voice caught, and he couldn't finish that sentence. He had watched men die all kinds of ways, and could narrate each without blinking. This sentence was too big for his mouth. Then we'll see if they're fit to claim the living, May said. She glanced down. She's got a fine keening voice, the sort those old walls in heaven might remember. What do we call her till she's named, right? Elias asked, suddenly aware that namelessness is a kind of cold. May thought a moment. Juniper. For the scrub that keeps a grip even in bad ground. For smoke that keeps sickness at the door. For berries that make a good tonic when winter gets in your lungs. She smiled the smallest bit. Also because it's pretty, and I like pretty on the mouths of women who've been done ugly. Juniper, Elias said, tasting it. The baby's fingers blue-edged from cold opened and closed. On the air. He offered the knuckle of his forefinger, and she latched like she meant to keep it. Heat began to come off her in waves. He felt the switch inside him flip, and was embarrassed by it, and had the good sense to let himself be embarrassed. May swaddled, checked again, tucked, and then, with that same efficient compassion that made men half in love with her and fully in debt, she shooed Elias into a chair. You'll sleep, she ordered. You look like you wrestled a storm and lost. I don't much sleep, he said. You do in my house. She put a wool blanket over his shoulders, and it was as if she'd draped authority along with it. If she fusses, and I'm stirring the bricks, you pat her with 2 fingers just so. She showed him. A steady drum near the shoulder blade, not too hard, not too soft. It tells a body it's not alone. He tried to sit watchful, but the room turned warm, and the baby's breath made that tiny wheeze all new ones make until the lungs learned their work, and the rain sang a low song in the stovepipe. His eyes closed. He dreamed in pieces. He was back, east with the reek of carbolic in his nose, hands on a boy's shoulder saying, hold on, to keep his own head from coming apart. He was small again, chin just over the table at his mother's kitchen, watching her cinch a sack of beans with twine, and her fingers quick as if the tying was a prayer she had to finish before it cooled. He was 30 with a badge on his vest knot. His, it never was his, and a man with a smile too white saying, that's the law, And Elias saying, "No, that's just your voice." He was in the desert, sun like a hammer, a silver concho stamped with letters he couldn't quite read, spinning in the dirt, like a coin that never decides which face it wants to show. He woke to sun slanting across the floorboards and the town. Beginning its day, the bell at the smithy, a mule braying complaint, the clatter of a broom on a boardwalk. Before thought got to him, he reached for the drawer where May had made a cradle, an empty dresser drawer lined with a folded towel and the blue quilt, like a man groping for his hat in the dark. Juniper was still. His heart stopped, and then she stretched and let out a squeak of dissatisfaction with a world that wasn't quick enough with breakfast. "Good," he said, voice rough. "Get mad. It's a skill." May came from the kitchen with a small smile and 2 bricks in fresh cloth. She took a bit more molasses water. "I've sent Opal Reed to fetch Etta Dorsey. She's still nursing her boy, and has more than he needs. If Etta says yes, we'll have a wet nurse part the day. We'll figure the rest when the rest gets." Here, Elias stood, joints complaining in a language of their own. "I'll go back out to the wash," he said. "See if there's sign. Tires, hooves, feet. Maybe the sack's got more to tell." May nodded. "Bring the sack if you can. Bring the twine. Men who do wrong think they're invisible. They leave a trail like coffee on a white shirt." She paused. "Don't go alone." "I'm not fond of company," he said. "Like I said," she answered, without looking at him. "Don't go alone." She set the bricks and fussed the blankets until Juniper made that warm, thrumming sound of pure content, and the little fist unclenched. "There's stew by the stove. Eat enough to make thoughts." He ate standing, the way men do when their legs don't trust chairs. The rabbit was tender, the carrots sweet. He found himself chewing slower than he meant to, as if the stew would notice and salt and take itself away. On the porch, the morning was rinsed clean. Puddles held scraps of sky. A yellow dog with more ribs than sense trotted past on some urgent errand. Elias leaned on the rail and squinted down the street. The saloon had its doors propped open, letting out stale smoke like regret. August Reed's hammer was already making its promise. Down near the end of town, the marshal, Tolly Raines, slouched, with a pretense of purpose, hat tilted, eyes doing their lazy sweep that all but deserved to be believed. Raines lifted 2 fingers in a hello that could be read as "I seen you at May's," or "I know you got a thing," or just "morning." In small towns, a gesture wears 3 coats at once. Elias answered with a tilt of his chin. He did not owe the law a story. He owed a baby one. He saddled up and rode back toward Salt Cedar Wash with the same care he had used bringing the child in, though now he had both hands free and his mind set on sign. The desert gives up its facts if you look at it slant. He rode slant. At the windmill, he dismounted and led the mare. Hooves scuffed "leave their own writing," and he didn't want to write over somebody else's words. At the cholla, he found the rock, where he'd stowed the sack, and pulled it free. The canvas was heavy with last night's rain, and the stamp looked lure for it. He ran a finger along the twine. It had been cut with a blade with a nick. The cut wasn't clean, but feathered one side, leaving a telltale ragged bite. The knot had been a square knot, started wrong, and finished worse. A person who tied for a living would have done it different, or a person shaking. He lifted the calico, scrapped the blue flowers where the kind girls wore when they wanted to be pretty, without anyone accusing them of being proud. He put both in his saddlebag. Tracks spoke in wet dirt. He found 2 sets of boot prints, one small, one bigger, both scuffed deep like men in a hurry. The small prints had a toe drag on the right. A woman laboring does that, Elias knew, because May taught him what tracks look like when pain has holds. Of a person. There were wagon ruts cut shallower than a loaded freight would make. The horse prints alongside were shod, left hind shoe throwing a little sea of stars where a nail had been reset crooked. He crouched with his hands on his knees, like a man who means to propose to the earth, and looked until it gave him a little more. The tracks cut east and then west again, circling like a hawk that can't decide which rabbit deserves dying. He stood. He could hunt this trail down. He had done that kind of work for men with money who wanted their cattle back and didn't care what else he brought them. He could start now and come back before the sun left. And then he thought of the baby's mouth working at a scrap of linen, and if May's neat labels and the way towns chew things up and call it order. The trail would keep. People wouldn't. He turned the Mare's head back toward Vesper's Gulch. As he rode, he felt the new edges of himself, like a man feels a tooth he didn't know was chipped until his tongue finds it. He had come west to get emptier, until he couldn't remember what he had set down back east. A baby had set something back in him, and now everything else had to make room. He reached May's door as Opal Reed came down the steps, apron flowered, and sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed with the dispatch of a woman whose life is a list she means to finish today, whether or not the sun agrees. "Etta will come," she said, breathless. "She said her boy sleeps like a drunkard, and she needs to let the milk out anyway, or she drown." "Tell her May owes her a pie," Elias said, "because women keep a different ledger than men, and you better write your entries legible." Inside, the baby had a color more like living than like a bruise. She blinked, unfocused and solemn, and blew. A bubble that made no sense in every kind of sense. Elias put the sack and twine on. May's table beside the mortar and pestle. May ran her fingers over the twine, as if it were a braid on a girl she knew. "Huh," she said. "That Nick's particular." "Left hind shoe throws stars," Elias said. "Greeley Cobb's blacksmithing throws stars," May said without changing her tone. "Because he pays August in drawing, and August don't do. Charity on a man who's got money for a deputy star." Elias felt his jaw set. He did not like to borrow trouble by name. Trouble came with a man's name, whether you called it or not. Still, the mind arranges facts even when the heart is trying to look away. "Eat a biscuit," May said, handing him one like a communion he didn't deserve. "You're about to go out in town and ask the kind of questions that brings you answers you're not ready for. Don't do it hungry." He ate, and the world got a little less tilted. He wiped crumbs on his thigh and looked down at Juniper, who had fallen asleep with her mouth open and one fist splayed like she was counting and had gotten to one and was proud. "Go," May said, eyes on the baby, voice on him. "Find out who's missing a day-old life." She finally looked up and met his gaze square. "But keep your hand close to your gun." Word moves through small towns like water moves through rock, slow until suddenly it doesn't. By noon, everyone knew a flour sack had cried Mama out by Salt Cedar Wash, and that Elias Finch, who generally minded his own weather, had ridden it into town. Juniper slept a deep, hiccuping sleep in May's drawer cradle, milk-drunk and warm from Etta Dorsey's steady grace. Etta had shown up with her hair in a kerchief and the frankness of a woman used to solving problems with what her body could make. She sat in May's rocker, nursed the child without ceremony, and made a soft clucking sound that drew the babies. Eyes even as they slid closed. "Lord, she's a hungry thing," Etta said, pinching Juniper's cheek with a gentleness that made the baby's mouth curl. "That's good. Hungry lives tend to keep living." Elias stood with his hat in his hands and felt himself rearranged by the sight of a problem easing without a word about it. He put the sack and twine on the table where May could look again when she had hands free, then took his leave with a biscuit May shoved at him on principle. "Go," May said, as if dismissing a hired man after the morning chores. "Bring me names that belong to tracks." He started at Dorn and Son Mercantile because the sack had told him to. The bell over the Yow. door jinked bright and useless against a room that smelled of lamp oil, coffee, and 1,000 hands. Rows of canned peaches and pickled beets shone like coins, and a glass case held needles, buttons, and folded calicos in colors that tried to be cheerful in a climate that had no interest in cheer. Mrs. Dorn stood behind the counter with her ledger open and a pencil tucked into gray hair, swept back so tight it made her eyebrows look surprised. She was a small woman with the spine of a fence post. Mr. Dorn moved in a slow orbit near the sacks of feed, counting in the deliberate way of men who don't trust numbers unless they've weighed them. Morning. Elias, Mrs. Dorn said, which carried a question she didn't ask, because this was a store, not a saloon. Morning, he said. He took off his hat and laid the sack on the counter, turning the blue stamp up where she couldn't miss it. You keep account of what leaves this place by stamp? We do, she said. Not because the county asks me, but because my own sense does. That one's ours, sure enough. Sold 3 of that batch Tuesday last. 1 to Enoch Lyle's Tent Folks Flower for the Lord, I'm told. 1 to the Triple to Opal Talbot signed. 1 to Livia Parnell, seeing as her boys eat like wolves. She tapped the stamp with a fingernail. The ink's right new drum. We switched last month when the old stamp faded like my patience. Elias slid the strip of calico from his pocket and set it down, small blue flowers wet dark at the edges, where rain had hung on. And this cloth? Mrs. Dorn didn't touch it right away. Her eyes sharpened like she'd struck flint. I know that bolt. She turned, knelt, and drew out a ledger from below the counter, the other ledger, the one that recorded what the first ledger didn't need to know. She flipped to a page and ran her finger. 3 yards 2 weeks back. Lydia Talbot bought. It said she was making a skirt for Sundays. Mr. Dorn looked up slow. And she never wore it, he said in a voice that had learned not to be surprised. Because I watch clothes on Sundays, the way some men watch hands at poker. Mrs. Dorn gave her husband a look that said the observation was noted, but not helpful. You be careful, Elias, she added, voice low now. Some men in this town don't like it when a story keeps being told after they've decided it's over. When have I ever been liked? He said, and tipped his hat at her proper. She slid him a paper twist of peppermint drops, as if he were a boy on an errand. He tucked it in his pocket with the cloth dot outside. Marshal Tully Raines leaned against the post with his hat set to shade a face that looked friendly until you read it twice. He fingered the brim when Elias stepped down. Found yourself a trail? Raines asked, lazy as Sunday. Found myself a store that counts. Elias said, That's my trouble with stores, Raines replied. Always counting. He chewed on a sliver of straw. You planning to walk that information over to the judge and ask him to bless it? I was thinking to ask August to look at a shoe, Elias said. Left hind, nail set crooked. Raines's eyes drifted to the smithy down the street. August says if a man sets his own shoe, he can tell by the way the rasp kisses the iron. He spat neatly into the dust. Cobb likes to pretend he ain't the kind needs anybody. Cobb's the kind needs everybody until they notice. Elias said. Raines's mouth ticked. Ain't that the gospel? You be careful you don't find yourself thrown in my cell for disturbing a peace that never existed. He slid a glance up the street, where 2 of the judge's hands were playing checkers and not looking like they were watching anything else. Town's an organism. It don't like surgery. Sometimes you cut to live, Elias said. Sometimes you cut because you like cutting, Raines said back, and his tone said he hadn't yet decided which one Elias was today. At the smithy, August Reed's hammer rang like somebody promising the future still got made out of the old world. August was a tall man gone square over years of heat, forearms to make a mule envious and a patience that let iron change its mind. He lifted a shoe out of the slack tub steam rising with a smell like wet pennies, and set it to the anvil. When he saw Elias, he didn't stop working, which was respect. Morning, August said, striking with practiced mercy. Heard you fetched rain into town in a sack. Rain fetched itself, Elias said. I just didn't leave it to drown. August nodded like he was not surprised. The world still tried drowning things that could live. What do you need? A look at some stars, Elias said. He stepped to the side bench and, with a bit of charcoal, sketched the pattern the left. Hind had thrown in the wet those little sprays, where a nail bent and kissed the dirt wide. August leaned in, wiped his hand, and frowned in thought. Man holds his rasp like a spoon when he's hungry, he said at last. Drag on the downstroke. Cheap nails from Lopez's wagon too soft. Cobb sets his own shoes because he thinks paying me means owing me. He don't like owing. He'd rather limp than owe. So you'd call this Cobb's print? I'd call it a print Cobb would make, August replied, careful. He tapped the sketch. But the county's full of men who'd rather be Cobb than themselves. If you're hauling one into the light, tie him clean. Elias nodded. He liked August for many reasons, one of which was that he could talk about iron and mean men. He cut across to the livery. Pigeons muttered in the rafters, and the sweet stale smell of hay and horse lay thick as a blanket. Nate O'Rourke, who kept the livery in the piece of saddles, ran a currycomb down a sorrel mare's neck with a rhythm that said the animal had already forgiven the mooring. He had the look of a man who had chosen quiet for a living and meant to be good at it. You seen Cobb's Bay this morning? Elias asked. Nate snorted. I seen him bite at everything that looked at him. Horse does the same. He hung the comb on a nail. Left hind kicked hell out of my doorpost, coming in nail popped proud, and he wouldn't let me set it right. Cobb says he'll rasp it himself when he's got time. I said a limp might teach him time. He said my business is stalls, not sermons. You see him ride out last night? I saw him ride somewhere, Nate said. Men who ain't doing wrong still act like it after dark. I tend not to chase them with questions. His eyes softened a hair. You chasing one with a question today? I am, Elias said. Then you watch your back, Nate said, picking up the comb again. Some men answer with something that ain't words. The saloon had its doors, propped to tempt a breeze that couldn't be bothered. Inside, the light was the color of tobacco spit and molasses, and the sawdust on the floor clung to boothils like bad ideas. Liza Bell, who kept the bar and the stories, polished a glass like it had offended her personally. She had hair piled high with pins that could go from decoration to weapon in one motion, and eyes that did accounting without paper. You come to drink or listen? She asked as Elias slid onto a stool. Listening's cheaper, he said. Not if you do it right, she replied, and set down a coffee poured from a pot that had seen war. On the house? For the baby. Everybody knows, Elias said, not surprised. Everyone knew before you did, Liza Bell said. They just didn't know they knew. She leaned her elbows on the bar. You're sniffing around Lydia Talbot. I'm sniffing around truth, he said. Same perfume sometimes, she allowed. Lydia's been coming in with opal for sarsaparilla and quiet. Cobb's been coming in for whiskey and noise. Brother Lyle's been coming in for a hand, to lay on people's shoulders like he owns them. She rolled her wrist, a gesture that could have been disdain or fatigue. I don't like men who act like they can tell God where to sit. You see Lydia the last 2 days? Elias asked. Not since 3 mornings past, Liza Bell said. She left with a face like a letter she couldn't bring herself to. Open. She tipped her head. You want my advice? I never do, he said. She smiled with no humor in it. Ask it anyway. Don't let Cobb make you the story. Men like him don't argue the facts. They argue the room. Get yourself out of the room before he changes it on you." The coffee warmed his mouth and sat heavy in his stomach, which felt like armor he hadn't known he needed. As he stepped off the stool, Brother Enoch Lyle appeared at his elbow as if conjured by his mention. Lyle wore a clean white shirt without a speck on it, which in this county was either evidence of holiness or vanity. His eyes were pale and busy. "Mr. Finch," he said, smiling like a knife laid flat, "I hear you're in the market for salvation." "I'm in the market for a thing a man left out in the rain," Elias said. "A man?" Lyle repeated, tasting the word as if it might be sour. "Sometimes it's a woman who leaves things in the rain, and then we must forgive her and help her and correct the path of her feet." "Correct it to where?" Elias asked. "To the tent," Lyle said smoothly. "To the Lord, to a place where choices are made by mouths that know more than theirs." "Whose mouth would that be?" Elias said. Lyle's smile didn't move. "You are a man built for stray causes," he said. "Stray causes are the devil's favorite toys. He winds them and sets them walking and laughs when they explode." "Then you better stand clear," Elias said. He nodded to Liza Bell, who made no sign of knowing anything except how to polish a glass. Outside, the sun had climbed to its hard place. Elias could feel the hours turn. He walked the street and made himself read faces the way he read tracts. "What did you carry last night? What did you hide? What do you want me not to notice?" A ranch hand named Leaper couldn't meet his eye. A boy on a barrel watched him like a hawk watches a snake that might be edible. Old Mrs. White swept her steps, as if a clean porch could keep certain kinds of dust from drifting in. He cut across to the Triple T's fence line to look, not to knock. Out beyond the first windmill, he saw a rag caught on a wire calico blue small flowers. He took the fence staple in 2 fingers and turned it gentle until the cloth gave. The tear matched the scrap in his pocket, the pattern continuous if you were the kind of man who noticed how small things line up. He tucked the new piece away and kept walking until the house sat full in his view, big, whitewashed, and smug as a parson with a secret. Greeley Cobb stepped off the porch into the yard before Elias could decide whether he meant to approach. Cobb wore his deputy star turned inward, toward his heart, as if he needed reminding where to aim. He had a smile that showed a lot of tooth and not a lick of warmth. "Finch," Cobb said. "Fine day for an outsider to keep riding." "I'm looking for Lydia," Elias said, neutral as water. "Judge's niece is visiting cousins in Santa Fe," Cobb said. "Left at first light in a wagon driven by heaven itself." "You must have missed her." "Busy night, I heard." "On the morning after a storm?" "Roads dry quick for some folks," Cobb said, the smile tightening. "You have something belongs to the judge?" "Nothing in my pockets belongs to him," Elias said. Cobb took a step closer so they could smell each other's breath and intentions. His was coffee and whiskey. Elias's was coffee and biscuit. "You're wandering into places that don't concern you," Cobb said softly. "A sack in the desert concerns me," Elias said. "A woman tied concerns me." Cobb's eyes flicked, just once, toward the tack shed as if a sound had moved inside it. The movement was small, the kind of glance a rabbit doesn't make, because a rabbit knows what eyes give away. Elias filed. "It?" Cobb's hand hovered over his belt where his gun sat resting like a dog that bites without asking. "A town is an organism," Cobb said, smile back like it had been waiting in his pocket. "It doesn't abide infections." "Then it ought to spit you out," Elias said before his wiser self could arrest the sentence. Cobb's smile widened to show confidence he hadn't earned. "Careful you don't trip over your own heroics." Elias didn't answer. He turned his back like a man who trusts the sun more than a mouth and walked away. It was a small victory that felt like a man giving a nickel to a train timetable and expecting the train to thank him. When he reached Mays again, The light had slipped toward evening's long, forgiving angle. Juniper slept with her hand flung open, palm up, that old reflex that turns into learning to hold. Etta had gone home with promises to be back after supper. May stood with a needle in her mouth, mending a hem with quick, even bites. "What did the town tell you?" she asked around the needle. "Besides that, it's a town." "That the sack's from your store," he said. "That the cloth is Lydia's. That Cobb's left hind throws stars. That Brother Lyle thinks paths should be corrected toward his tent. That the judge has a secret he thinks the porch boards can hold." May pulled the needle free and bit the thread. "Porch boards hold secrets until a woman with a broom finds them," she said. "Then they're just dirt." Before Elias could answer, something hit the window with a crash and a scatter of glass. Reflex put him between the cradle and the sound before thought caught up. May didn't flinch. She set the baby's blanket heavier, then crossed the room and picked the rock off the floor with a steady hand. A note was tied to the stone with twine like the cut strand on May's table. She undid it, smoothed the paper, and read, aloud in a voice that did not change. "Leave the wash to the wash. Bury what you found." Elias took the paper and held it to the lamp, looking for the tremor in the hand that wrote it. The letters were squared, careful, the way a man writes when he watched a teacher once and liked the look of it. No flourish. The R had a little hat on it, the way men taught by itinerant preachers make their R's. The ink had bled at the edges where the nib was too heavy. A smear at the A where a left hand had dragged too soon. "Left-handed," he said. "Greeley Cobb writes left-handed when he signs for feed," May said. "Turns the paper just so, grinds his lip with his teeth, makes a show of a name that don't belong to him." She looked at the rock in her palm, a river stone smoothed by years of water, making it useful. "People do cruel before they do difficult." Elias set the rock on the table. It sat too politely. He took his Colt out of his holster, checked the cylinder like a ritual, and set the gun beside the rock as if introducing them. "Some men answer with something that ain't words," he said, repeating Nate's warning to hear how it sounded in a room where a baby slept. May went to the door and looked out into the blue of coming night. The street lay quiet, the kind of quiet that in other towns would be peace, and in Vesper's Gulch might just be a held breath. Somewhere a coyote said its short prayer to whoever listened to coyotes. "You going to the revival?" she asked without turning. "I wasn't," he said. "You are now," she said. "Because men who throw rocks into women's windows, like the sound of their own sermons, they'll gather where their voices echo." Elias picked up his hat. He did not like tents that smelled like sweat and proclamation, but he liked less the idea of letting the men inside them rename the town. They walked to Coyote Hill with the rest, because towns move like herds when the air is thick with something about to break. Lanterns turned the canvas to a ship's belly, and Brother Enoch Lyle's voice rolled out sweet and clouded. People who had never been in a church felt themselves pulled by the cadence of one. Elias hung back and watched. Way a hunter watches wind. Cobb stood near the front with his thumbs in his belt, and his star tucked toward his heart again, like a secret he wanted to warm. The judge was not there, which told Elias something about who thought what needed doing could be done without blessing. Laid hands, people wept, coins clinked into a box with a slit cut neat. After a while, the tent swelled with amens the way a barrel swells with hot day. And then, with that same smile like a knife laid flat, Lyle said the words that tell you a man thinks he has made a fire hot enough to melt anything thrown on it. "Friends," he called, "there are Jezebels among us, and bastards, and the wages of sin." May stepped forward before Elias even knew she'd moved. Her shawl slipped, her braid tugged by the crowd's breath, and she said in a voice that made the canvas remember wind, "There is also a baby who said mama to a town in Met." It. Heads turned that didn't want to turn. Lyle's eyes narrowed the way a cat's do when a snake turns around. Where is Lydia Talbot? Elias asked, not loud, but aimed. People look where they think guilt might be hiding even when they don't want to. A handful of gazes slid toward a wagon tied down under the shadow of a live oak just outside Lantern Light. August Reed saw it. He moved like a man who had set metal all day and was now prepared to set a different kind of thing. He slid a blade under the rope, lifted, and the canvas shrugged back. Lydia Talbot sat inside, pale and cornered, wrists chafed. Where rope had believed it could make her smaller. Her eyes found May and Elias, then some point in the middle distance where she had put her fear so she could stand up to it. A sound went through the tent, a groan, a prayer, a curse is different. Mouths called it by their names. Cobb's hand fell to his gun like gravity was a favor. Lyle lifted his arms, but the crowd wasn't looking at him anymore, and he felt it like a man feels his shadow step away. Reins appeared at Elias's shoulder, hat low, hand near his holster but not on it. Nobody's drawing, he said, talking. To the room more than to the men. You draw, and you're digging tomorrow. Elias felt the air change, the way the skin notices when a storm turns its face. The night had gotten itself a task. The rest of the chapter, the next hours, the porch, the wash wasn't here yet, but it had sent a note ahead, back at May's later. After the crowd had spilled and flowed, and people had moved as one animal with too many opinions, Elias sat at the kitchen table and looked again at the rock and at the note, at the careful square letters with the left-handed smear. Juniper fussed and then sighed, a soft sound that unspooled the tight knot behind his ribs. He reached over and put 2 fingers on her back, the way May had taught him. She quieted, which is not a miracle, but something better proof that right. Things done small still change rooms. May poured coffee that didn't need it and set it down near his hand. We're past the asking, she said. Tomorrow the town decides what sort of town it is. Elias nodded. He slid the Colt back into its holster and felt the familiar weight sit where it always had. He didn't feel braver because of it. He felt accurate. Outside, the wash talked to itself in the dark, remembering names. Inside, a baby slept, which is what hope looks like when it doesn't know its own name yet. Asterisk morning arrived with a pink the desert rarely admitted, a color like a shy truth told once and then hidden again. Elias Finch saddled his mare before. Most of the town was stirring. May's words still in his ear. Tomorrow, the town decides what sort of town it is. The streets of Vespers Gulch were washed clean from the night's storm, puddles standing like shallow mirrors that caught the weak dawn. A rooster crowed with too much confidence from the back of the livery, and somewhere a hammer clanged August Reed already at his forge, because iron waits for no man's sleep. Elias turned the mare toward the hill where Judge Talbot's house sat like it had been planted by a different hand than the rest of the town. The Triple T Ranch was a kingdom, and the judge its monarch. Even half crippled by age and illness, the man's shadow covered more ground than most men alive. At the judge's porch, the big house had a porch that wrapped around it like a belt around a proud belly. White paint peeled from boards that had been laid by men who'd long since gone to seed or dust. Elias dismounted, tied his reins loose, and climbed the steps with a heaviness in his boots. A woman named Opal opened the door. She was a house servant in title, kin in practice, carrying herself with the brittle calm of someone who knew which side of the ranch fence kept wolves out and which side kept women in. She led Elias into a study that smelled of smoke, leather, and old judgments. Judge Talbot sat slouched in a high-backed chair, blanket drawn to his chest. His hair was white as alkali flats, his skin blotched and veined like old maps. But his eyes were sharp still, the color of lapis polished smooth by arrogance. "You're Elias Finch," the judge said, his voice heavy as wet timber. "I've heard 3 versions of you and trust none." "Best not," Elias answered. "You've been poking in corners that don't belong to you." Elias let that sit a moment. "I came to ask after Lydia." The judge's jaw tightened. "My niece is where she is meant to be. And where's that?" "In grace." The word dropped like a rock into still water. Elias felt the ripple of it in his bones. "Grace don't look like rope burns," he said quietly. The judge's hand twitched under the blanket. "You are not the law. Neither are the men." "Who think they are?" Elias replied. The judge's eyes slid to Opal. "Mr. Finch has lost his way. See him out." Opal showed him the door with the efficiency of a blade. She didn't meet his eyes because meeting would mean choosing. Elias stepped onto the porch, again where the sun had grown bold. Greeley Cobb was waiting. He stood by the hitch rail with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his deputy star turned outward now, gleaming like something he'd polished for the occasion. His grin showed teeth too white for a man who chewed tobacco as often as Cobb did. "Careful, Finch," Cobb said softly. "The line between Good Samaritan and varmint is whichever one I draw." "Then draw it clean," Elias said. "So we all see." Cobb's grin widened. "Tonight, Coyote Hill, after the revival. We'll pray, and then we'll talk about sacks." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. Elias didn't answer. He swung into the saddle and let his mares. Hooves reply against the dirt road. The town hears back in Vespers Gulch. Elias found May and told her what the judge had said and what Cobb had promised. May listened with her hands deep in a basin of laundry, wringing shirts until the water ran clear. "Then it'll happen tonight," she said, matter of fact. "Will what happen?" "The truth." She wrung one last shirt, snapped it straight, and pinned it on the line where the wind grabbed at it like a hungry hand. But truth never comes alone. It drags blood behind it if you let it. Word traveled faster than Elias expected. August Reed heard and told a pair of teamsters who were unloading crates of dry goods at Dorn's. They told the saloon. The saloon told the street. By sundown, half the town was headed toward Coyote Hill, not just for salvation, but for spectacle. Some came with their Bibles, some with bottles, and some with guns polished cleaner than they'd been in months. The revival tent swelled like a ship's belly, lanterns glowing through white canvas. Brother Enoch Lyle's voice rolled out sweet and sticky, promising miracles as if they were coins he could flick into the crowd. His blue eyes shone too bright, like sky stolen from somewhere else. Elias stayed near the back, hat low, watching. May stood to one side, arms crossed, shawl slipping from her shoulders. August loomed beside her, a hammer still hanging from his belt, as if ironwork and justice were part of the same trade. Marshal Raines leaned against a post with his usual lazy air, but Elias saw his hand, brushing the butt of his revolver like a man remembering where it lived. Lyle thundered about sin and redemption. Women wept. Men muttered amens. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Wide-eyed Dot. Then Cobb stepped forward, his voice carrying smooth and oily. "Friends, we've got ourselves a misbegotten story, a baby found where no baby should be. Some men," his eyes cut toward Elias, "think that means we point fingers at respectable folk. I say we let Brother Lyle speak the will of the Lord." Lyle raised his arms, his shadow tall against the canvas. "The Lord speaks to each heart, in its own language. But I tell you this, Jezebels walk among us, sowing shame, and the bastard fruit of sin must be cut away, lest it rot the tree." A murmur rippled through the tent, dark as thunder. May stepped forward before Elias could catch her sleeve. Her voice rang like iron on iron. "Last night in my house, I heard a sound, a baby's voice, small but true. It said, Mama. Not to God, not to sin, but to us. And you'll all hear it too, if you stop your ears from being cowards. The tent shivered as the crowd shifted. Women pulled their shawls closer. Men looked down. Guilt is not a word. It's a draft, and it moved through the crowd like cold air under a door. Elias stepped up beside May, his voice steady. Where is Lydia Talbot? Heads turned slowly, unwillingly toward the wagon tied down in the shadows outside. August Reed didn't wait for permission. He strode forward, knife out, and sliced the canvas ropes. The cover fell back. Lydia Talbot sat inside, pale as a ghost, her wrists raw from rope, her hair hanging in wet clumps. Her eyes darted, first to Elias, then May, then to the crowd that had once been her neighbors. A sound went through the tent, half gasp, half growl. Cobb moved fast, grabbing her arm. She's in the care of the law, he barked. May's voice cracked sharp. She was in the care of the law when her child was put in a sack? You call that care? Lydia's lips trembled. Brother Lyle, she whispered, voice barely carrying. He said the child was a weed in the Lord's garden. Cobb said the judge's bloodline must stay pure. They took her from me. The tent went silent. The kind of silence that comes when lies are dragged into daylight. Lyle lifted his hands. The devil plants lies? Then why tie her? August roared, his voice like a hammer on an anvil. Lyle faltered. Cobb's hand twitched toward his gun. Storms in the desert keep their own clocks. By midnight, the clouds had burned away, but the wash still ran high, carrying grit and broken branches from far-off hills. The air smelled sharp with wet clay, and frogs sang in places that had been dry for months. Vespers Gulch did not sleep, not after what had been pulled into the open at Coyote Hill. Gathering at Maysmire's house had become the town's hearth, though the front window still bore a board where the rock had shattered it. Inside, the baby Juniper slept in her drawer cradle, lips puckered as if she were already practicing words. Lydia sat near, pale but upright, shawl pulled tight. She had not left the child's side since being freed from the wagon. August Reed stood at the door like a tree with a hammer still tucked in his belt. Marshal Raines paced, chewing the end of a matchstick he hadn't bothered to strike. Elias sat at the table with his hat in front of him and his Colt beside it, as if the two were pieces in the same game. They'll come, August said. They already tried, Elias replied, thinking of the riders May had faced down. Cobb don't know how to quit. May came in from the stove, wiping her hands. Then the question is, when they do come, do we meet them as a town or as scared pieces of one? Raines blew out a breath. Most towns don't get to decide. They just find out. Maybe this one does, May said. The judge's house hat. Dawn, the knot of them, Elias, May, Lydia, August, Raines, and a half-circle of townsfolk too restless to stand by rode to the Triple T word, had spread like prairie fire. Men and women followed with lanterns, pitchforks, or just the weight of their voices. The judge was waiting on his porch, rifle across his lap like it was both cane and crown. His blanket had slipped to his waist. He looked thinner, smaller, but his eyes were still the same cold blue marbles, polished by decades of command. Cobb stood beside him, hat low, star bright on his vest. You bring a mob to my door? The judge called, voice carrying like a gavel. We bring your niece. May answered, and her child, and the truth you keep trying to bury. Judge Talbot's gaze dropped to Lydia. His face worked, but he kept it hard. You shame this house. I carried life, Lydia said, her voice shaking but strong enough to reach the crowd. You'd have rather I carried a grave. The judge shifted, blanket sliding further. I won't have the Triple T ruled by a bastard born of sin. Lydia lifted her chin. Then you'll learn that this child is not a sin. She has a name. Juniper. The name carried through the yard, caught and repeated in low voices. Juniper Cobb stepped forward, his hand resting on his revolver. Judge, let me end this. Put the problem where problems go. He jerked his head toward the wash. Water carries sin away. Elias's hand brushed his colt. That's not water, Cobb. That's murder. Cobb sneered. And you're a drifter who doesn't know where he belongs. I belong here tonight, Elias said. The cry. The tension stretched thin as a whipcord. Then, from May's arms where she cradled the baby, came the sound. Mama. Not loud, not even clear. But it threaded through the hush and found every ear. People shifted, drawn to it. The way thirst bends a body toward water. The judge flinched. His old hand trembled on the rifle. Slowly, like a man reaching through fog, he extended his fingers toward the baby. May stepped close enough that he brushed Juniper's cheek. The tiny head turned instinctively into the touch, searching warmth. The judge gasped, as if struck. His eyes filled with something no one had seen there in decades. Greeley, he rasped, not looking at the deputy. You tied this child in a sack? On your say? Cobb answered, voice flat. On the Lord's. The Lord didn't write me no note, the judge said. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked old enough to break. And if he did, I can't read his hand. The breaking Cobb saw the tide turn and reached for his pistol. He never cleared leather. Elias moved like a man who'd waited all his life for this moment. He slammed shoulder first into Cobb, knocking him back against the porch rail. The gun clattered into the mud. August single quotes S boot came down on it, grinding metal into earth. The crowd surged. Hands grabbed Cobb, yanked him down, bound his wrists with the same rope he'd used on Lydia. He kicked, cursed, spit, but he was smaller now, shrunk by the daylight. Lyle, who had crept forward with his tent preacher's smile, lifted his hands. To speak, May fixed him with a look that froze him in place. Not a word, she said, voice low, heavy. Not one. And he obeyed. The judge's choice. The judge sat slumped, rifle across his lap, blanket at his feet. He looked at Lydia, then at the child in May's arms, and finally at the crowd that had once called him master. I built a house out of a name, he said slowly. A bad house. Wind got in, and I called it strong when it was just mean. He swallowed hard. If Lydia wants this land, she has it. If she wants to leave, she leaves with what she needs. But this child stays alive. My blood or not, she stays alive. A murmur went through the people. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was enough. Aftermath by sunrise, Cobb was locked in the marshal's cell, the star stripped from his vest. Lyle slunk off before noon, his tent rolled and loaded on a wagon, bound for some other unlucky town. The judge sat his porch facing the street instead of the wash. Folks said he never touched a rifle again. Lydia stayed at May's at first, then moved into a small house near the mercantile. Women brought her cloth, food, gossip, and the kind of watchful care given to someone who had been nearly erased. She carried Juniper everywhere, proud as a banner. Juniper learned to laugh a sound that scattered shadows like thrown pebbles at a flock of crows. Men softened when they heard it. Women wept without knowing why. As for Elias Finch, he made himself. A corner of town, a cot in the livery loft, a chair on May's porch, a habit of showing up when work was heavy or silence was needed. He had come west to be empty. He found himself full again, and it startled him daily. One evening, with the sky burning down to coals, he sat with Juniper on his knee while Lydia washed carrots at the pump. May leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. smiling her small, knowing smile. Juniper gripped Elias's mustache, burbled, and then made a sound. Mama. Clearer now. Stronger. Lydia froze, then laughed and cried all at once, water dripping from her hands. Elias grinned until his cheeks hurt. May whispered, "That's a good word." And it was. The desert listened, and for once it held.